Welcome to the Exponential Minds Podcast. The research, development, launch, and growth of new technologies is creating incredible momentum in the modern world. Join futurist Nikolas Badminton as he talks with the innovators and the exponential minds that are tackling some of the biggest problems and creating solutions that are propelling humanity to the next level.
Hello and welcome to the Exponential Minds Podcast. I'm Nikolas Badminton. I'm a futurist that travels around the world, speaking to many clients about planning for positive futures. And today I'm talking with one of the original futurists out there, Glen Hiemstra. So Glen's an internationally respected expert on future trends, long-range planning, and creating the preferred future. Glen has advised professional business and governmental organizations and served as a technical advisor for futuristic television programs as well. So the world is interesting. And today, we were just talking before we started recording, there's lots of people out there, that hang futurist onto their job titles. And now, if we look back, when you started out over 40 years ago, it wasn't that commonplace. You had some of the people out there like Alvin Toffler. I imagine Ray Kurzweil was out there, but maybe not calling himself a futurist. But what really turned you into looking towards the future and becoming a futurist?
Yeah, my story is really simple, actually. So I'm a young middle school, high school student in the 1960s. Space program catches my imagination. I go to college in a liberal arts college in Spokane, Washington. I'm a college student there when they hire as a new president a guy who comes straight to the college from the Apollo spacecraft program, where he was director of program planning. And he gets up in front of his first college convocation and he says, "I'm a futurist." And his name was Ed Lindemann. He had worked for the Rockwell Company, which built the craft that went to the moon. And he was a founding member of the World Future Society, which had started up right there around 1970 or so. So I'm young. I had become acquainted with him. I'm involved in student government. So I hang out with the president some of the college, and he becomes kind of a mentor. And he starts doing futurist thing and bringing futurist speakers. He brings Alvin Toffler to the campus. He brings Robert Theobald to the campus. Asks that everybody on the campus read Future Shock when Future Shock was new. And so it kind of captured my imagination. Long story short, I went off to graduate school to be a professor of communications. Went to the University of Washington in the 1980s to work on a PhD in communication. This Lindemann guy says, well, the first guy to go meet at the University of Washington is another Ed named Ed Wenck. And Ed was the first science advisor to the U.S. Congress, wrote the legislation that created the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and he becomes a PhD advisor. And then in the middle of all that, this Ed Lindemann guy dies on a trip to China very suddenly. And he's retired as a college president. He has a full speaking slate. His wife, now widow, calls me and says, "I know you're in graduate school. Ed had a full speaking slate. Would you like me to give them your name?
Wow.
Maybe some of them will want you." And a half a dozen said, "Yeah, we got to have somebody. Let's have this guy." And so I began making my first presentations sort of as a futurist while completing my graduate work. Then I go off and I'm a college professor for 3 or 4 more years and start consulting on the side. And my bio says 2 decades, but it was really about 1990 that I gave up the college teaching gig. So it's actually been 3 decades now of full-time futures work. And so that, so it was a mentor relationship, sort of a long-time personal interest in the future, then a mentor, then this sort of weird opportunity to go out and do some speaking in front of large audiences who otherwise would never have hired me, but because they needed somebody and this guy was no longer around, it kind of gave me a foot in the door,
Yeah.
And then by 19, my last college teaching job, it was in a systems design program, studied systems theory, taught some future studies. And so, I really felt ready to go out and be a full-time consultant starting about 1990, and that's what I did.
That's super interesting as well. What did it feel like? Because you must have been in your mid-20s when you started doing talks about the future, right?
It was. And it was fascinating. You know, I was borrowing a lot of material from him. This is a great story. I might get to writing this blog today. If not, by the end of next week, I'll get it done. I've been thinking a little bit about writing a memoir.
Right.
Okay, and I thought, you know, I have a file box somewhere of old speech notes. And I used to do these sort of outlines on paper that I would then use to do my speeches. This was obviously pre-PowerPoint days and all of that. And sure enough, I found the box, and there are the notes from my very first speech as a futurist in 1980.
Yeah,
it's about a 5-page outline, and I got to write about that. And there are two things that I really noticed about it. Number one, the fundamental approach that I had taken from this mentor, which is all about asking these 3 questions about the future: what's probable, what's possible, what's preferred, what was there already. And number two, you know, it's both, well, I don't know if it's discouraging or encouraging or just a simple observation to say some of the issues that we were talking about in 1980 are the same issues that we talk about in 2020, 40 years later.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, environmental issues, the impact of technology on the future of work and jobs and so on. The themes it's pretty amazing to see how some things seem to change very fast and other things seems to change virtually not at all even in 40 years.
Yeah. And we have buckets of those things that we're concerned about, right? And it's like we're just watching them. And I mean, back in the 80s, there was a lot of information moved less quickly, right? As soon as we hit the mid 90s, the internet pops up. By the early 2000s, it's going a million miles an hour, and suddenly information's everywhere, and everyone's saying the world's worse than it's ever been, and this and that, and it's like, well, actually, no, information's just democratized, it's more widely available, and now we've got this world of misinformation and so-called fake news and all the social media platforms that are accelerating everything, right? And suddenly there's catastrophe everywhere, from the coronavirus to climate to whatever. But again, all my clients literally ask about those 3 things, and can I come and speak about them with you? So it's really interesting when we look at those probable, possible, and preferred futures. I mean, if you look at Alvin Toffler, in maybe you look at some of the work that like Buckminster Fuller did back in the day, this was really visionary stuff. And I remember reading a book called The Usborne Book of the Future. And it was like in the 70s, late 70s, and I was about 8 years old. And you may remember the book. And it was, you know, Raytheon and Boeing and NASA. And you had Arthur C. Clarke and a number of people, you know, fed into it. And it was wildly fantastical. And we're not so fantastical, I think, in 2020 anymore, because
I think that's right. Yeah, I remember one of the people I read at that time was a guy named Gerard O'Neill, who was a physics professor or something at one of the Ivy Leagues, and he was writing about, you know, space colonization and building giant wheels in space and mass drivers to space and building he had this vision of the Hyperloop before everybody called it the Hyperloop, building these massive tunnels all around North America and shooting trains at 500 miles an hour through these things. And I thought, this is just really amazing. One of the things that I think is true is that if you look at the futurists, the people we now call futurists, although many of them called themselves futurists in the 1970s, that's when the academic programs began at the various universities. But most of those people had come out of other fields, of course, and began calling themselves futurists. But they were sort of that post-World War II generation that had this massive optimism coming out of that whole experience, and surviving it, and then seeing the technologies that came out of there from, you know, that became popular at the time, from television to jet airplanes and so on, and feeling like we could probably do just about anything that we wanted to do. And so you could call it naive. And it was, generally speaking, before there was concern about global warming, there was concern about the environment. I mean, Earth Day was started in 1971 or 72, somewhere around there. So there was certainly deep concern about polluting the environment, but not really about overheating the planet. And so there was a naivete about that. But mostly they believe that if we collectively decided to do something, we could probably do it. And that's been lost. I think it's, in my opinion, it's a shame that that's lost. I think it is helpful to be more realistic and to be aware of the massive threat that, let's say, that 8 billion people can pose to the planet unless we work in really, really smart ways. But you go back to Buckminster Fuller, who was a hero and who I got to see do one big seminar at the World Future Society in 1980 or 82, I think it was. My very first time I ever went to those meetings. And he was doing one of his Dymaxion workshops in which he had all these people in this massive room, kind of imagine remaking the planet. And
amazing.
But his whole theme was, if we would agree to shift from, as his language was, shift from weaponry to livingry, instead of putting all our resources into war and put all of our resources into peaceful activities, we could do, he used to say, everybody on the planet could live like a millionaire. That's been lost. It's very hard to find futurists today who would say those kinds of things out loud and not be ridiculed for saying them.
Right. I mean, you had Jack Fresco and the Venus Project. I think Jack Fresco passed away in the past few years, like really recently, and his ideas, and we've kind of lost that fantastical nature. And if suddenly we get brought in, and I've started to tell stories now. I was at a conference in Iowa speaking to 900 people that do land investment, agriculture, whatever. And I finished off with a story of the global world of agriculture in 2220. And it's really interesting because you can be fantastical. And I spoke about the end of the energy wars. And then 50 years after that, all wars entirely were gone, and global networks of what is true abundance, not what abundance is called in 2020, which is like a bunch of billionaires talking about, stem cell therapy and living till they're 120 years old, right? So it's kind of interesting that, I've started bringing that practice back, but, you almost look out at the audience and they're like, what do we do with this information? And then it's interesting following on speaking, working with people. And I think one of the things that I've seen that you're doing and what you just described in that Iowa presentation is be willing to go very far into the future, to begin with an assumption that it's possible, at least, if not probable, that human beings will be around in 200 years or 500 years or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years. And that's kind of rare right now. Of course, organizations who call you, they say, well, come and help us think about the next 3 to 5 years. And I try to convince them to at least think of a couple decades ahead. Right. But you by thinking centuries ahead, of course, you give yourself permission to do two things. Number one, to be fantastical, but also then it frees people up to think kind of in inspiring ways. Yeah. In an inspirational way about the future. One of the great projects, yesterday I got a call from a publication, did an interview with a journalist. Yeah. And there is a so-called futurist. I've never really thought of him as a futurist. His name is Zoltan Istvan. Yeah. He really presents himself more as a transhumanist. That's right. Yeah. And it turns out he's running for president. I didn't know this. Yeah, he did it last time. He did it in 2016. He did it in 2016. But his platform is basically national governments, namely the U.S. national government, should invest more in science research for immortality. So anti-aging research. Right. Okay, that's kind of cool. That's fine. But what I told the reporter was, and he wanted to know what I thought of whether futurists could have an impact on national politics by running for president. Well, I said, it turns out I was the Washington State campaign coordinator for a futurist named Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was an early visionary futurist, very involved in the World Future Society work in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And she ran for vice president in 1984. Right.
and she did a campaign, and the campaign, she called it the Campaign for a Positive Future.
Yeah.
And it was an odd thing. I can send you the link to her 10-minute speech to the convention in 1984. But her platform was very simple. The president of the United States has something called the War Room, where he manages wars and conflict. And she said the vice president should have something called the Peace Room, where they keep track of all the breakthroughs and all the opportunities that are emerging all around the world, and leverage those opportunities and breakthroughs, technological breakthroughs, social policy breakthroughs, and so on, to build a positive future. And I watched that speech before this interview yesterday, this 10-minute speech to the 1984 convention by Barbara Hubbard, and I thought, nobody talks like that right now. It's very rare to hear somebody say, well, the evolution of humanity, the evolution of the species requires us to build a positive future. And here are the things that we should be doing. We should, be shifting to new kinds of energy, and we should be ending in order to begin to decrease our impact on global warming and eventually reverse global warming. And we should be shifting from weapons to instruments of peace, and we should be developing new forms of energy. It's pretty rare to hear people do that, and it was very cool. I would like to see more of it. If I do anything here in the next few years, as I wrap up my career, let's say as a futurist, that's kind of my intention, is to see if I can bring a little bit of that back, as you've said that you were doing in Iowa.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as well. You sort of talk about Barbara Marx Hubbard and that campaign for the positive future. VP has the Peace Room. It's like, what was Al Gore doing? When he was with Clinton, and then what did he go on to do? Because he couldn't have done what he's doing now if he would have ended up being president of the United States. Not in the same sort of activistic, fantastical, visionary way. There's no way that he could have done it.
No, I never got to ask Al Gore this. I just met him once. It turned out I have a daughter who did an internship in Washington, D.C. in the White House, and she was assigned to work on the domestic policy office for Al Gore when Al Gore was vice president. That was her assignment that academic year, and she loved him. And I should have thought at the time of having her ask this question whether he ever heard about that Hubbard campaign, because he did try to turn the vice presidency into something of a futures office, a locus of thinking about how to do things better in the future. Of course, the vice president who followed him, Dick Cheney, then reversed that completely and made it again a sort of a war-centered kind of thing. But Al Gore probably made the best stab at leveraging high office as a way of thinking in positive ways about how to build the future.
It's interesting when I work with the United Nations, and I'm working with them ongoing around the climate change framework, Paris agreements and whatever, and I'm sort of on the periphery helping them think about designs and resilient futures and whatever. It's almost like we need these organizations to wrap themselves around governments to really push and apply pressure, right? And to really feed that information in. I mean, we've got Andrew Yang, right? I mean, he's been very progressive. Yeah. And there's Elizabeth Warren. There's a number of other people on the flip side. In the Republicans, there's one guy, and he's literally turning everything back. Everything that the Obama administration put in place and whatever. And that's a big conversation there. But really, we work with companies, but we're really just small parts of the puzzle. And really, positive futures can only be shaped once, some argue once policy and money is put in place to support it, right? But then we've got like a $2 trillion budget for the military in the US.
Yeah. My when people ask me these days, what are the major trends that I see shaping the future? What should we be paying attention to, let's say, as futurists? I think the number one, even dominant trend right now is the emergence worldwide of this sort of reactive, nationalistic, retro view of how the world should work. that we should retreat into our nations, and that we should strengthen our borders and keep everybody else out and go back to tariffs and all the things everybody's familiar with what's happening. And it's not just in the U.S. It's in Turkey, and it's in countries all around the world. I'm trying to figure out why that is, and unless that trend is reversed, if that trend becomes the dominant trend, then it's very hard to do anything about. We're not going to do anything about climate change. Well, we're not going to do anything about shifting to more positive futures. In my opinion, unless that is confronted and dealt with, and we'll see. I mean, the next, we've advocated, you and I just now, for thinking very long term about the future, but it could be that the next half dozen years, in the U.S., next couple of election cycles will be really critical in figuring out whether that is in fact a new kind of dominant trend that's going to go on for a long period of time, or whether that's one that is a blip on the radar and will be reversed. We see it in Brexit. Brexit is the other example of that going on.
Yeah, I mean Brexit. I mean, I'm a Brit and I'm a proud Canadian as well. And
yeah.
In Toronto, and I look back to the UK, and it's like, you know what? It's a hangover from Thatcherite Britain. I voted Tony Blair when he came in, New Labour, and New Labour was literally eventually became New Conservatives, and then
that was a surprise,
yeah, and then it was like, okay, so we're gonna work this out, and charismatic leaders like Tony Blair, like Barack Obama, and whatever, really, really smart people can really help shape it and do positive things. I mean, I still don't think we can forgive any administration for making Iraq happen. That was one of the most biggest mistakes there was, based on no information. But it just seems to go in cycles. The 1950s. There's a lot of problems. Cross culturally around race and different cities and violence. And I think it turned up again in the 80s. So that's 30 years later. And then from the 80s to the 2010s, oh, surprise, it's 30-year cycles. So maybe this is just what happens every 30 years. For some reason, we've got cementing themselves in this power in the world, right?
Yeah. I mean, it could be part of generational cycles, a la Levi Strauss and that whole thinking that it has to do with different generations and sort of what the theme for that generation is, and that whole process has that kind of, I think it's a 40-year cycle, or maybe it's a 30-year. I've also thought it related to that. It could be related to that, but it might be slightly different. It might just be a kind of a cultural forgetting kind of cycle that, you deal with something, then the generation has sort of dealt with it. It sort of literally passes away in the case of the post-World War II generation or the World War II generation. And everybody forgets what it was like to live in an ultra-nationalist time where, and the thought of conflict between nations stops being scary and starts being kind of romantic, and think, well, that'd be kind of fun to have a war. Wouldn't that be exciting? And I wonder if there's a little bit of that, as next Monday is the 75th, I think, anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz camp in Germany, and it's bizarre to think that it's only 75 years ago that happened. But everybody who was there in person, the last ones are in their late 90s.
That's right.
So soon everybody who was there will be gone, and then everybody sort of forgets what that was like. So you have a new rise of anti-Semitism around the world. That people literally don't remember how horrible that was. So that cycle might just literally have to do with this weird part of human memory that unless we were there personally, we just don't quite remember. And we have this tendency to romanticize things. I mean, you and I are just romanticizing positive futures. Maybe it's all part of the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that you've got the liberals that are fighting all the left-leaning people, and I talk about liberal dictatorships. It's the same kind of thing. I wrote an article recently about fighting personal dictatorships. Can you sit down with a right-wing, nationalistic, to a point that there's been violence or activism and misinformation and propaganda? Can you sit with them and can you argue and discuss and really start to liberate both of your thoughts about understanding the trauma that came before the position and whatever. And I grew up with kids that literally got turned in the 1980s in Thatcherite Britain by, these big brothers that turned up and they were skinheads, and suddenly these kids, these young men like 16 to 18 years old, they suddenly had a family, and it was a scooter gang, and it was the National Front, and there was this. You sit there and you fight against them and you talk to them, and compassion and it is very hard to muster up in the face of these individuals, and because you almost have to teach them what compassion is before you can have those conversations, right?
Well, yeah, and I've been reading a couple of things just in the last couple of days, kind of on that theory that the best way to reach people who are thinking in a completely opposite way from you are to sit down and ask them questions and try to understand their viewpoint. Is, there's nothing earth-shaking about that perspective. I remember when Peter Senge was writing about company vision, and his argument was that the best way to communicate a vision in your company, your organization, if as a visionary leader, is not to tell people what your vision is, but to ask people what their vision is, and then look for a way of bringing them along. But I'm reading these things, but the difference today, and you alluded to this early in our conversation, is social media and internet and so on. The reinforcing that goes on, no matter what your perspective is. I mean, I have my Twitter feed, and I curate that Twitter feed pretty hard, so that is mostly things that almost all things that I agree with, that make me feel good about my own perspectives and so on. And I'm a very open-minded person in general, and talk about the need to be open-minded. But you think about all that reinforcing that's going on now compared to, as you said, before the early 1990s, when the internet really became a thing. I think it's much harder to have that kind of mind-changing conversation, and so it's more talking past each other. It does make me concerned about how we get through this sort of hyper-polarized era that we're in. It could be more than just another cycle, because national governments, national intelligence agencies, and so on are weaponizing all of this kind of thing. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard.
Over the last couple of decades, I want to ask you this. Have you seen the makeup of your clients changing? Different industries, were prevalent in the 80s and 90s, and now in the 2000s, it's a different kind of industry.
Yes, there are two things. Number one, the 90s was, when I started doing this full-time in the 90s, everybody wanted a vision for the 21st century.
Right.
So it was actually a really good time to work as a futurist consultant. And my work has consisted basically of two things. There's the public speaking side, so conference and convention keynotes, that kind of thing. And then there's the consulting side. Has been pretty much running organizational retreat style long range planning sessions, where an organization will say, let's look further ahead than we usually do. Let's create a new vision for ourselves, and let's take a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year horizon. So in the 90s, I work primarily in the U.S. I've done some international work, a fair amount over the years, but everybody in healthcare wanted to do a new vision, but the Clintons were in charge, and they were all about healthcare reform, and so that was driving a lot of healthcare people. Virtually every government agency, cities. Did a lot of work with cities, large cities like Atlanta, that wanted to have a vision for 2020. Right. Natural resource organizations, forest product companies, including Canadian ones. And then some of the technology companies. Technology companies have been kind of an exception because they tend to be self-sufficient and to think of themselves as smarter than everybody else, which in some ways they are. And so they feel less of a need for outside kind of consulting. They say, we're the futurists. Right. Then 2000 happened. Everybody had their 21st century vision. 9/11 happened. Everybody got very afraid of the future. Right. And so there was a dip. There were the economic downturns as well, and there was less interest. But in the last 10 years, since 2010 or so, there's been a very big uptick again in organizations. It has been very much around energy, right? Electric utilities, oil and gas associations. And that's been quite fascinating. They really want to hear about the future. And before we started the podcast recording, you and I were talking a little bit about oil and gas, and in general, they're very curious about this. They're aware. They're not yet willing necessarily to change anything that they're doing,
right?
But they're certainly aware of it. So, in the last few years, it's been heavily around energy, heavily around transportation.
Right.
Transportation agencies, what's the future of driverless vehicles? Is that really going to change how transportation works? And in fact, some technology companies. And then there is retail. I've done a fair amount with retail because retail has faced so much change. So a lot of retail companies have said, come in and help us think about what's the future of consumer behavior and can we have storefronts and so on. A little bit, that's been true. Financial services, the same thing, same kinds of questions. The most interesting one that I worked on is the now embattled Boeing company.
Oh, yeah.
They had their 100th anniversary. They'd been in business for 100 years in 2016. And I had done being in Seattle, I had done a fair amount of work with them over the years, presentations to their management associations and some strategic planning facilitation and with various divisions and groups and so on. Anyway, they said, let's look ahead 100 years since it's our 100th anniversary. And they assigned a team to do that. The team contacted me and we put together a 3-day offsite deep dive into what's the next 100 years in transportation, aerospace, space development, and so on. And we had a really exciting session. Imagining, or really not so much imagining as asking the question, what will be some strategic opportunities over the next 100 years if you're an aerospace company,
right?
And that was quite good. So, but then that was around transportation. They were interested in autonomy and 3D printing and additive manufacturing, as they called it, and will it really change manufacturing? Will it really change vehicle design and so on and so forth? So those are some of the changes. Number one, this high interest in the future, followed by a dip in interest in the future. Now a re-emergence of an interest in a somewhat longer term future, and then less about healthcare and government agencies, and now more about energy, more about transportation, and more, I would say, about retail and consumer behavior.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I see exactly the same thing. Retail is actually one that's interesting because, we've been measuring the health, the fiscal health of the country based on like retail sales and how good, it's completely wrong in my mind. But suddenly, this is this juggernaut. It's consumerism, it's capitalism, and now you look out to like China, and, communism does. Yeah. Communism, it rarely exists in this world. I mean, you can go to Laos or you can go to North Korea, right? Two very, very different countries, right? And North Korea is like that incredibly scary sort of a case study that going, right?
Yeah. Are they really, North Korea as an example, are they really communism, or are they really just kind of family dynasty hypocrisies, Right. And that's probably really a little bit more of what they are. And that's one of the dangers in the world is you get these emerging, we call them national populism or nationalism movements, but they're really movements around consolidating power in the hands of a ruling family or a ruling set of families, and making them, or enabling them to just steal a lot of money, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been chatting to a number of organizations in the past 4 days. I've chatted to 3 different organizations. One was a quite well-known design agency out of Berlin. And I chatted to 2 different size consultancies. One's got 7,000 people globally, and another one is like a startup, like between 3-10 people, just really starting off. And they're all tapping people like us on the shoulder and saying, oh, how can we consider dystopian futures to inspire our planning? Or how can we build up our futures practices and whatever? Because suddenly they're seeing this as a huge opportunity. But we're rarely seeing any company in the world actually having a chief futures officer. I mean, there are some people in the advertising industry and media, and, head of futures and things like that. But it's very different than building out a foresight capability in an organization.
I agree. There are a few, and you know of them. Of course, there's Ray Kurzweil, very famously at Google. I knew Dave Evans when he was at Cisco, but then he left to do some entrepreneurial things in the Bay Area, and I don't think Cisco replaced him as the official futurist of the company. Right. There's Cheryl Conley at the Ford company. If you've never met Cheryl, if you could ever get her on your podcast, you really should. She's fantastic.
Yeah, I've chatted to a number of people. I actually, I'm on Ford's mailing list, so they keep sending me.
Are you? Yeah.
Oh, if you want to talk about this mailing list, go ahead. Like, that's great. It's like, oh, can I interview Cheryl? They're like, can we get back to you? Because it's like, again,
she's very hard to get. I interviewed her. I did a video interview with her at a conference at which I was on the organized group, and she'd come as a speaker. But it's been very hard to get her to have time to do anything since then because she's so busy. But
when you've got embattled companies, I mean, Ford's embattled. I mean, it's lost its crown. It could still be a significant player in the world, right? With the right kinds of investments. But
it should be. Although I saw a really fascinating article. A guy wrote it 2 days ago in Forbes.
Yeah.
And you might have seen this on your Twitter feed because it's similar to mine, I think. And it was, he asked, who should Tesla buy? Should Tesla buy Ford or GM? And he did it partly tongue in cheek, but partly seriously. Like,
right.
Tesla sells every car they make at a premium price. And they're finally at their kind of takeoff point as a company, I think.
Yeah, I predict.
And Ford and GM, as we said, are embattled.
Yeah, I mean, I drive a Chevy Bolt 100% electric, and the reason it's so good is that they outsourced all of the design and the build of everything that's electric within it, and literally just threw a Chevy badge on it. And it's a completely different experience than any other Chevrolet out there. And it's kind of interesting when you get that perspective. It's amazing. I actually prefer it over like Tesla 3s, whatever. I actually made a prediction. I actually think that within 18 months, Apple's going to buy Tesla. I think that's going to be pretty bullish if it happens. But if you look at, $1.39 trillion, market cap for Apple right now, where, their Project Titan internally, for self-driving vehicles and whatever, it keeps going off the rails, and they laid off a couple of hundred people. I don't know. I'm going to put like a gentleman's bet of like $100 down.
Well, yeah, okay. I wouldn't rule that out. I'd be a little bit surprised.
Yeah.
It obviously depends on the value, and it totally depends on what Elon Musk wants to do. If he would rather turn his attention more to his space adventures and less to the car company.
That's exactly what I think is going to happen. Anyway, we digress into our predictions.
Yep.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, and what's really interesting to me, I didn't know the depth of your background and how suddenly all the way from those early years at university. So you've literally been a futurist for almost your entire career, which is kind of unheard of because a lot of people are repurposing, or they've gone from like music. Like I think Leonard did a bunch of future music, and now he's into this.
Right.
Kurzweil doesn't even call himself a futurist, but under the Singularity University brand, he's suddenly become that thing. But he was an inventor, and all these people are suddenly moving into this world. I mean, I come from a background of computers from the age of 10 years old, but artificial intelligence in the 90s, and building out massive data infrastructure. And someone like throws the word futurist at me 8 years ago, and suddenly here I am, having these conversations and being part of some really interesting movements around the world. And I think that's what we're part of, is like the people like you that have sort of blazed the trail. And now, as futurists, we're like these bounty hunters of truth. And it kind of seems like Twitter's brought us all together. And there's lots of sort of, what is a futurist? What isn't a futurist? Are you progressive enough? And if you're not progressive enough, are you like, the old white guy that does it? And where's these new futures? And I love it. I love the conversation. I love everyone. I mean, this podcast is about talking to everyone and finding out what makes people tick, really. But I find it interesting. Everyone thinks about the future. We just do it, but on steroids. Inviting people in to ask, what if the world was different? What if we were to take a different path? be creative, look a little further ahead, and maybe, the world's going to be in a better place.
Yeah, that the debate about how you get to be a futurist has been an ongoing one. Actually, it has emerged and reemerged over the years that I've done this. And there was that little kerfuffle on Twitter recently about who gets to be a futurist and who doesn't. And in one of the last meetings of the World Future Society, when it existed as a worldwide organization, I did a session with Cindy Freeman, who's in my think tank group. And Cindy was at the time the president of the Association of Professional Futurists, and still is a faculty member at the University of Houston Futures program. They call it the program in strategic foresight now. So we did this presentation, and the title was The Future of Futurism. And we sort of did a counterpoint. She argued that, you should have to get a credential to be a futurist.
Yeah. And
I argued that the goal of futurists ought to be to teach everybody to be a futurist, and everybody who walks out of the room from working with you, Nikolas, should say, "Hey, I think I'm a futurist."
Right.
It's two different perspectives. If somebody comes up to me and says, "How do I become a futurist?" My answer always is the very first thing you should consider is going to school. Go get an undergraduate degree, go get a graduate degree. There are a few places in the world where you can do that. If that's not feasible, that's not realistic, then there's a set of reading you can do. You can hang out with people who are futurists. You can go to conventions and conferences. And there's ways to begin to think more professionally as futurists. I think there is sort of a contrast between those who are futurists just by, let's say, by mindset, and those who have some professional background, which you can acquire by practice, by reading, by studying, by going to school, and so on, and both have their place. But my whole perspective for all these years I've done this is to say my goal is to get more people to think of themselves as a futurist,
right?
To adopt that longer term perspective, to adopt a perspective of thinking about future trends in terms of what's probable and what's possible, and to think about vision in terms of what a preferred future is, and how might we do something different this year to make a more positive future more likely, etc. But it's an interesting debate. Again, my bias is let's turn more people into futurists rather than kind of create a walled garden and say we're the futurists, you are not a futurist. And do more to get organizations, cities, and so on to think longer term about the future. I think that ought to be the goal.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to wrap up the interview. I think that's what we do, and exactly the same thing. Build the community, have the conversations. I learn the most by spending, I go to a conference, I speak there, or I go in an organization, I stick around. I stick around.
Yeah.
Talk to a lot of people, and the perspectives, we can't read articles in Inc. or Forbes or Bloomberg, right, and suddenly take to the stage with any level of credibility. We have to have the conversations like we're having today, but we need to have them with the people that don't necessarily agree with what we think should be the future. And those counterpoints flexes our muscles around doubt and really plumbing the depths of every single preferred, possible, even preposterous future that could exist. So, Glen,
I should add that we should talk about the four P future: the probable, the possible, the preferred, and the preposterous. I like that. Thank you.
I talk about preposterous a lot, but that's a separate. I think that's a separate interview, and that's a separate person. And maybe we'll get that done in a couple of months. But I'd like to thank you very much, Glen, for spending your time today, joining us from over there on the West Coast in Washington State, and really just sharing some of your experiences. I think it's incredible perspectives on how this has been built up over time. And for those people that do want to get into futurism, be part of the conversation. And go out there and have conferences and do meetups and start chatting to organizations in your organizations. Just get the like-minded people together, and suddenly, movements start happening. Thanks very much, Glen.
You're welcome.